Wait a few seconds for all of our participants to enter the webinar. We're slowly entering, so I'll just go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. I'm delighted to host today's program on behalf of our museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. I'll be introducing our guests more formally in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for this event. Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee and museum who passed away a few years ago. We're happy to honor his memory with these programs, which he would have loved so much. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and all our other programs. Now, let me formally introduce our guests. Today, we are welcoming Hayley Campbell and Jessie M. Gomes for our discussion of Hayley's book, All the Living and the Dead, from embalmers to executioners, an exploration of the people who have made death their lives. Our moderator is Jessie M. Gomes, M.A.S.C.F.S.P. C.P.C. CCO. He is a licensed funeral director and embalmer and a member of the Connecticut Funeral Directors Association's Executive Committee. The organization is comprised of funeral directors at more than 220 funeral homes across the state. Jessie serves families at Malloy Funeral Home in West. He is recognized as a certified funeral service practitioner through the Academy of Professional Funeral Service Practice. He is a certified planning consultant from the National Funeral Directors Association and has completed the NFDA's Certified Crematory Operator Program. Jessie is an associate professor and a program director of the Funeral Service Department at Goodwin University in East Hartford, and is director of operations at the Human Anatomy Laboratories and director of the Anatomical Gift Program at the Frank H. Netter MD School. Sorry about that, folks. In North Haven. He received celebrant training and certification to better meet the needs of families during their time of loss and is a member of both the British Institute of Funeral Directors and the British Institute of Embalmers. And now on to our author, Hayley Campbell. Hayley writes for Wired, BuzzFeed, The Guardian, GQ, Esquire, Empire, Vice, Fightland, New Statesman, McSweeney's, The Comics Journal, and hosts the Unpopped podcast for the BBC and Must Watch on BBC Radio 5 Live. She wrote a book about Neil Gaiman, and her latest book, All the Living and the Dead, was published this year. Now we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat along with our guests. If you have any specific question, though, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this. So that's it from me. Please sit back and enjoy, and don't forget to post your questions in the Q&A. Over to you, Jessie.
Thank you, Omar. Welcome, everyone. I'm sitting here in what we call the Bone Room at the Frank H. Netter MD School of Medicine at Connecticut University, where individuals come to learn and be prepared for a future in medicine. I've been a licensed funeral director and embalmer in the state of Connecticut for about 10 years now, and I have other responsibilities, like Omar said, educating the future of medical professionals and future funeral service professionals. And on to our conversation today. Hayley, your book most certainly is fascinating and inquisitive, but all the while sensitive, interviewing many people in the death care industry or death care profession. You shine a light on humanity and you explore a lot of delicate areas of the industry and profession. For those of you who have not read the book yet, either in print, online, or audio format, Hayley, can you tell us what motivated you to write this book?
Well, after your big biography there, you could have ended up in it. So this is a book where I talk to people who work with dead bodies in all different ways. And I wrote it's sort of been in my head ever since I was a little kid, because people have called me a weird kid, but I don't think that's true. I was a kid with lots of questions about death and dead bodies. And I grew up, my dad is a comic book artist. And when I was 3 to when I was 13, he was working on a book called From Hell, which is about the Jack the Ripper murders. And it's very gory. And when he was drawing the pictures, he had lots of reference pictures up on his drawing board. And these were crime scene pictures and autopsy photographs. And I only realized they were scary when I had friends come over and they were like, what is that? Whereas I kind of wanted to know everything about them, who were the ladies and what had happened to them and what happens to them now, like where did the dead bodies go? And so whenever I was at home, I had all of my questions answered. But when I went to other people's houses or I went to school, it was a Catholic school as well, I found that teachers would kind of dodge my questions, or they would tell me about heaven, which didn't really answer my question about what happened to dead bodies. And it all got a bit more confusing around Easter when we were told that Jesus came back to life. And whereas I was sitting there in the church going, if he was dead for this many days, what did he look like? I had lots of questions that just weren't being answered. So I carried that curiosity with me until I became a journalist. And the best thing about being a journalist is you get to ask all sorts of questions, and people let you, and they don't, well, you might sound like a bother, but if you say you're writing a book, you somehow have it's like having an FBI card. You gain entry to all sorts of places that you wouldn't normally be allowed. So I've always been interested in what happens around death and dead bodies. And I just exploited my position as a journalist to go and speak to these people. And I wanted to follow the body from deathbed to burial or cremation and speak to all of the people who may come in contact with it. And there are more than you would think, and there are more than I thought when I started this. And each of them are fascinating. And I'm incredibly lucky that they let me see what they did for a living, and find out why they wanted to, because everybody's got a reason. I'm sure you've got a reason too.
Yeah, most certainly. As I read through the book, I related mostly to the funeral director, obviously, anatomical gifts, and the funeral director part of those specific chapters. Is there any profession that you found, or any part of the death care industry that you found most interesting above all?
The one that I had no idea was a thing until I was midway through the book was the midwives who just deal with stillborn babies or babies who aren't going to live very long. And to me, they are the most hidden of all the death industry, because you only find out about them if you're in that situation. And I think they're heroic. The things that, that the bereavement midwife who I met, she'd started out just as a regular midwife, and a woman lost her baby while she was there. It was, she was very young as a midwife when she first encountered a baby who wasn't going to live, and she found the whole situation traumatic in herself, and it wasn't her baby, but she thought that there was something that could be done better about it. And I found that again and again with everybody I interviewed. They had come in contact with their future jobs at some point and found that there was something lacking in what was being offered to them. And so they took it on as a personal thing, that they felt that they could affect change. And certainly the bereavement midwife wasn't just making things better in that moment when a baby might die, but she was completely thinking about all of the emotions that come afterward, and she wanted to be one of the people who had met the baby, because that's a big thing around stillborns, that parents are mourning someone that nobody else has met. So she really wanted to be there and be one of the people who had met them. And so she's not just there for the birth. She sees her job as remembering and being part of that little club.
You did a great job discussing in conversation with her the dichotomy between a birth and a death that are pretty much simultaneous. That was an interesting
Yeah.
perspective.
And it was something I hadn't thought of. She was not on my original list of people to interview when I had done the book. It was a pretty standard, I wanted to talk to the funeral director, the embalmer. I've always wanted to go to the Mayo Clinic, so I had the anatomical gifting director. But she turned up unexpectedly when I had seen a baby's autopsy that really affected me, when I went to speak to an anatomical pathology technologist. And talking to her was part of figuring out my own emotions around what I'd seen. And I never actually got real therapy for it, but I found speaking to her was really therapeutic. And just getting your thoughts in order, and because I'm sure there is another world where I could have seen that baby autopsy and come away with massive regrets that I'd ever started this, and I don't regret a thing. And yeah, it's just another part of life that you don't know about until you see it. And yeah, it's good.
You wrote about several topics in there, and I'll let you talk about them a little bit. But tell us about one job that you thought you were going into, one of the professions that you were going into that you knew the most about, and found quite the different, quite opposite.
Embalming.
Oh,
I I didn't go in with all of the knowledge of what it entailed, but I went in with opinions, because I've read Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death, and I'm friends with Caitlin Doughty, and both of them are quite anti-embalming. And so I went in with a kind of change my mind attitude, whereas with everybody else I was more open to everything. And it was a retired funeral director who said I got it all wrong, and there are some cases where it is helpful, whereas Jessica Mitford talks about how it's just this money-making machine, and it's a way of the funeral industry to prey on the vulnerable. So that was the only interview where I went in not like it was combat, but I did expect to come out thinking the same thing. And I came out, I didn't know all of the other instances when embalmers were deployed. Like, I didn't know that when a plane goes down, they're part of the emergency team, that people are pulling the bodies from the ocean or the surroundings, and before they are sent home, they need to be embalmed. I didn't know that. And I'm somebody who has read about embalming and spoken to people before, but it's just all of the little hidden bits about the funeral industry and death in general that I find really interesting. Even now that I've written this book, you find out new stuff all the time. But embalming was the one where I've changed my mind. I wouldn't say I would like to be embalmed, but I do understand the purpose behind it far more than I did when I just read Jessica Mitford bitching about it.
right. Was there a light bulb moment when you walked in, or when something that was said, or a smell, or an observation that you were like, "Holy cow, this is not what I thought"? What was that particular pivotal point?
It was when I was speaking to the retired funeral director, who was also an embalmer, called Ron Troyer. And he used to work in Wisconsin, and he had embalmed both of his parents. And I also spoke to another funeral embalmer here in the UK who had embalmed both of his parents. And I thought it was really interesting, and raised a question, Because if it is something that is just a money-making machine, why would the person who's making the money do the embalming of his parents? He said, because Ron Troyer, the one from Wisconsin, was a little annoyed with me because I had described the process of embalming as violent in a magazine article, in a Wired magazine article. And he said what he did to his parents wasn't violent. And he said it was, it was caring, and he felt like he was doing what he should do. And so that made me think, okay, maybe I've got it wrong. Because he, as a funeral director, he wasn't somebody who was just in it for money. He was telling me about different things he'd done in his career that could have actually lost him business and lost him money, but he felt that they were important. Like the fact that during the AIDS crisis, when many places weren't taking AIDS victims, he was. And also, if families said they didn't want this person's friends or lovers to come and say goodbye to them and had barred them from entering the funeral home, he would let them in later on after the family had left. And if anyone had heard about that, or it really could have damaged his business, but he felt it was important for the dead person and for the living, and so he did it. And he told me so many stories that I couldn't fit in the book, and it was just again and again he was putting himself out there in a way that he didn't need to, and in a way that wasn't money related. And so I thought, if he's pro embalming, there's something here that I'm not seeing.
Sure, and I valued how you said that in the book, because the funeral profession is certainly a calling, more than it is a profession. It's a lifestyle, and I think you covered that with that particular chapter very well, and you mentioned it here. So thank you for that. Now that the book has been out for some time now, maybe people have read it, you've certainly gotten some feedback. Is there a profession or a component of a profession that you wish you would have added now that subsequent to the book being published, that you've learned about since then?
I do wish I'd spoken to hospice workers, which was in my original plan. But the thing with writing a book about death is that if you don't make your spotlight really small on something really, I want to talk about this one thing. And in my case, I wanted to talk about the dead body. If you don't have your spotlight really strong on something, the book becomes huge and unwieldy. And there are so many books written about death, and they're either, quite academic things that are quite theory based, or they're about dying, or they're about grief. And I thought the place where I could fit my book was the body, which people seem to forget about sometimes when we talk about death. Even when I was telling people that I was writing a book about death, they thought I was writing a book about grief. That's the thing that's sort of socially acceptable to talk about. So unfortunately, the hospice workers kind of fell into the dying category. But I've had some hospice workers write to me and say that they love the book. I've even had a friend read the book and then go volunteer at a hospice.
Wow.
So it is something, and it's probably something I will explore in an article later. I'm not sure if it fit perfectly in the book, but it is something I'm still interested in.
Very interesting. Very good. The next question is kind of a two-part. Did you have any apprehensions going into the book? Anything that you were apprehensive about? And then after the book was published, any apprehensions on how you thought it would be received with the public?
I didn't have any apprehensions going into it because I was quite cocky, mistakenly so, I think. Just I thought I could handle everything, and there were some parts that I couldn't, and they were unexpected. But it's like Mike Tyson says, you don't know how you're going to react, and everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. So there was an element of that, but going in, I was fine. The book came out in the UK 2 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine. And so I didn't have any apprehensions about how it was going to be received, but my publisher certainly did. And they worried that we might look like we were profiting off death if we were going to market a book about death when death was everywhere. And I was annoyed because I said, that's the point of my book. Death is everywhere all the time. And they wanted to try and talk about it in a way, how do we say what this book is about without saying it's about death? And it really felt like something was being missed there, that there was some huge point that I had been trying to make that was being missed. So I think it came out in a strange time in the UK. I think it came out at a better one in America because it came out in August. I always worried that particularly the bereavement midwife chapter might be, I really didn't want it to be too soft in a way that books that with pastel covers and maybe bunny rabbits and things. I didn't want it to be like that, but I also didn't want it to be so horrible that people couldn't read it. I just wanted it to be truthful. And I've found that I've got letters from women who have been through that. And one said, this happened to me years ago, and I haven't been able to explain to my family and friends what I went through. And this ward sounds like exactly where I was and what I went through. And so now I feel like I can give them something and say, I went through this. And so I didn't know that it would become a helpful thing. I'm really glad it has for some people. I've had a few letters from women who've been through things like that. I just didn't want to get it wrong. I didn't want to get that tonally wrong. And so far, I think I've been okay.
Yeah. I enjoyed the book as a whole, but the one part I found most fascinating was the death mask sculptor. And to me, for being in the thick of funeral professions, that's something we don't see often, and it's something that's very rare. I've never seen it in my career, but it kind of gives a snapshot, a Polaroid picture of that point in time, that death, time of death. So that's what I found most interesting, and I will dive into that a little bit more. Which topic that you wrote about do you want to dive into more, that you'd like to do more research on?
I really found all of the stuff in the chapter about the disaster victim identification. I found all of the historical stuff about Spain to be really interesting, and the reasons behind why we want the bodies, why millions are spent getting bodies back from natural disasters or plane disasters, and we do it and we don't really think about it. And I think what happened in Spain, where they had this thing called the Pact of Forgetting, where after General Franco's rule, there was this law put in place that said, if you talk about what happened during his rule, and if you try and find the bodies of people who were killed, you're breaking the law, because we've got this thing where everything will be fine if we just forget it happened, if we just wipe the slate clean. And I think it says a lot that there were so many old ladies who just would not rest because they had, their fathers and mothers had been killed years before. And there was one particular one who died the year after her father's body was found. And it's like she had gone, okay, I've achieved my thing now and I can go. And I think the human attachment to having the body around is so stark in those historical stories. And now there's stuff going on in Spain where they are digging up the mass graves, and they are trying to identify people. And I think all of that speaks to how important it is to have a body. I remember being at a funeral directors convention thing here in the UK, and a man got up and he delivered a speech, and I think he was just trying to get a rise out of everyone. And he said, "Why do we need a body at a funeral if we're not even going to see it?" Because in the UK, it's mostly closed coffins. And in that room, it was like fighting talk. Um, and it was, I'm not a funeral director, so I was just sitting there watching everybody. But he really was going, "So what's the point? What is anyone gaining from the body being there?" But again and again, I kept finding with the funeral directors and with the homicide detective, I kept being told that the family needs the body there. And even if they can't see it, the presence of it in the room is huge. So I'd like to investigate that more. I think I've touched the surface with it in my book, but yeah.
You start all of your chapters and every of the professions of the book with a bit of a story, anecdotal story, which I valued. It was a way to get into the profession without hitting it right on the head. Did you do this purposefully? Was it a means of kind of coping with the profession itself, or was it what was your drive behind that? Those little stories. One particular, I remember you. I forget which one it was, but you were driving an old Nissan sedan down because for whatever reason, I'm picturing myself driving down the highway in these antique style cars. Why did you do that?
It was a really bad car, and I wanted to publicly shame the car. It was a rental. um, well, I think that I any way I could find to make the reader feel like they were with me, maybe in my top pocket, just being shown around, I think is useful when you're talking about something that is so emotional and there's so much baggage with it. Any way that you can write it that makes them feel like they're there and they're not, you know, watching from far away. I think, and it's the little human things that make me feel like some job or some story is meaningful. Like the little human things that people do all through the book with that aren't part of their job description. They just do it because they feel like it's right. um those are the things that hammer home how important the job is and what it means. And like the gravedigger and the fact that he collects molehills in a little pot because they land softer on the coffin when the priest does the ashes to ashes bit. All of that is so much more meaningful than just explaining what a job is and why it exists. Um, and also, like I say, it's such an emotional thing that I didn't want to make it a memoir. I didn't want it to be a book about me, but I think it helps if you know what my baggage is and you know what my experiences are and you know how I feel about stuff. Um, I thought that was good for you to know up front. But what I didn't want to do was tell you how you were supposed to feel about everything after I told you about it. Something that was really important to me in the book was that I just wanted to tell you what things were like, and I didn't want to say whether burial was better than cremation, or you should be embalmed or you shouldn't. I just wanted to say, here's what everything is, and you can have your own opinions.
You certainly have given us a lens into a lot of areas of death care, funeral related businesses that either are shied away from or many people will never have the opportunity to experience. It's a very closed door, non-glamorous type of process, which you described. What is your feedback then from the readers that you've communicated with?
Lots. I've found that I've done a few signing lines for events here in the UK, and I found that nobody does small talk with me anymore. It's immediate big talk. immediately, before they tell me their name, they tell me something from their history, something that is deeply personal. They tell me about how they held their wife's hand as she died. Um, or they tell me about, I had a message from somebody telling me about the greatest regret of her life is how she didn't go and help dress her mother 30 years ago, and how she hadn't told anyone that before, but she felt like the book had given her a space to talk about it. I feel it's a massive privilege to be told these stories. I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to do with them. But even I've been doing some strange little publicity things in the US, American phone-in shows, radio shows. We don't really have them in the UK like you do in America. And so I was a bit nervous about doing them because anyone could phone up. And I was getting amazing stories from old men who were in their cars driving down a highway. There was one who told me about how when he was giving blood as a teenager, he was sitting in the hospital and an old woman came in, sat down beside him, and they were waiting together for 4 hours. And she died next to him. And before she died, she said to him, "You're the only person in the world who knows my entire life story." And that was the last thing she said, and she died. And he said he thinks about her like once a week, and he's now in his 70s. And it's stories like I thought I did a really bad job of when I was, then it was, "Hayley, do you have anything to say?" Like, what do you say when somebody says that to you? I thought it was interesting that both he and I had these profound experiences with dead people, and they were both relative strangers to us. But I think what he was really looking for was, you know, she taught him something about life, but also he was there for her in her last moments. Imagine living to be an old lady and you get to spend the last 4 hours of your life telling your entire life story to someone who wants to listen. I think that's huge. Of course he thinks about it every week.
Yes. The follow-up question to that is, out of the individuals you interviewed, which I'm assuming they may have read the book, you covered the whole spectrum of death care industry. Was there any feedback that you got from perhaps like the gravedigger who said, "I never knew this about the embalmer," or the anatomical gift coordinator who said, "I really never knew this happened at the crematory"? Those types of dynamics or conversations and reflections that you got back from the individuals you interviewed.
Not since the book has been out, but I was telling them each other's stories while I was interviewing them.
Oh, interesting.
Because I there was time between them, but whenever there was something related, I would tell them. And the thing that really struck me was the fact that they are so separate from each other, and they don't know about each other's jobs because they are just focusing on their one thing. And what really surprised me was I had some sort of idea that once you had a job within death and had been around dead bodies, you were probably cool with everything related to dead bodies. But I found that everybody had a thing that they wouldn't do. So when I was at the crematorium and Tony was showing me how he pushed coffins into the furnace, I told him, "Oh, a few months ago, I helped dress a dead man for his funeral." And he looked repulsed. He said, he'd been doing this job for 30 years, pushing coffins into the fire in a basement. But the idea of touching a dead body, of helping him get into his funeral clothes, was so repulsive to him that he couldn't believe I'd done it. And everybody I spoke to kind of looked at me like I was a little strange for even wanting to do this. And the first question that they would ask me was always, "Why would you want to talk to me?" Because they found that their job was not something that, it didn't make a dinner party come alive. It really turned the mood if they brought it up and explained what they did. So they have learned over time just to keep it quiet. And then I turned up and said, tell me about it. And they were like, but why? And like I must be the strange one for wanting to know. But yeah, there's so much that they don't know about each other. They're just focusing on what they do.
Right. I certainly valued that as I read through. Of course, I'm looking at it through one or two lenses, but it certainly has shaped how I will most certainly conduct business in the future. Just knowing these little things and these little nuances of the different components of our profession. So that most certainly, from my standpoint, helped mold me as a future professional for
Oh,
sure.
good.
Um, which you spoke about several, like I said, several components of the death care industry. If you had to unplug yourself from journalism and plug yourself into one of the parts that you wrote about, one of the components, which one would you choose? And which one would you say, absolutely not?
I don't think I could be a gravedigger. I would put my back out immediately and then have to be sent home. I also don't think I could deal with the living all that much. I would much rather help dress dead people for their coffins. I could do that. I think I could also do the autopsies. I didn't find them, they didn't turn my stomach or anything. But I would much rather deal with the dead just on my own. Or, as much as I know about death, I still find living, grieving people hard to be around, as anyone does, because you don't want to say the wrong thing. So it's a big deal. I think the strange thing to come out of this book is I've now become kind of a helpful person. I wasn't a helpful person before, not in that I wouldn't help, but just in a practical sense. I wasn't the person who would, drive you somewhere or help you move house. I don't, I'm not that great at that kind of stuff. But now I've had friends whose mothers have died and they've asked me about funerals and who can I call. And also I had a friend whose mother died who really wanted to donate her body to science, but the place that she had signed with rejected her, I think for reasons that they were full at that point. They couldn't take her on. So I had to find somebody else in the UK who would take her, because it was her last, and it was her only thing she wanted. She didn't have any special funeral requests. She didn't want a funeral. She just wanted to be donated to science. So I was able to help find a place for her to go. And that's a strange favor to do for a friend. I can help find some scientists who will take your mother's body. But suddenly I got to call all of my connections and say, who can I speak to here? Who can I speak to there? And I was useful. And I think that this will last. Like I feel like I'm more prepared around death than a lot of people. And certainly around family deaths, I feel like I've put my own oxygen mask on before helping other people. So I know my sister will fall apart when our parents die. And so will I, but I'll know what I have to do. And also I'll know what I want to do around it that will help me process it. So I feel like I've thought about this stuff before the point where you have to, and you've got 2 weeks to do it.
You certainly have a unique perspective going into it now, which is interesting.
I got lots and lots of texts from my family when the Queen died. They were like, what have they done to her body? Is she even in the box? And I said, yes, she will be embalmed. They were like, they can't embalm her. Of course they will have embalmed her. The only intel I had was that they had changed the funeral directors because she died in Scotland rather than in London. And I knew the one that she was going to, because it's the one royal funeral director in London. But having died in Scotland, she went with, I noticed it on the hearse. It was someone else's name.
Right.
But yeah, pardon?
Which was probably removed via the marketing standpoint.
It was in the initial filming of her leaving the castle, and then it somehow disappeared.
Yes, that's very true. Any of the folks that you interviewed, did anyone offer you a job now that you have this background?
No, but my mum is convinced that I should go and work with Poppy, the funeral director, in the first chapter, because she said, you obviously loved being there and you loved what she stands for. So why don't you go and do that instead of this writing thing? Come on, Mum. I've got one book out, so let's see how that goes.
So no career transitions for you in the future?
No, I don't think so. There's so much, I still want to go behind the curtains and see about other things in the world, other topics. And I think as a journalist that's what you can do. So I'm not ready to commit to one job yet. It feels like I get to investigate them all.
As we're winding down here, I want to give everyone a chance to ask some questions in the chat, but just a few more questions. Any advice you would give someone, a young person, a career change person, who might be contemplating entering any of these components of funeral service or death care profession? Any insight that you would say, yeah, this is good, or do you research?
I would say don't listen to anyone else who says it's a strange thing to want to do. It's not. I think it's noble. I think depending on what you do, it can be heroic. It is hard. Do your research and also realize that while you may be dealing with the dead, a lot of this comes with dealing with the living at their most vulnerable. So you need to think about whether you're okay with that. That's the thing that would put me off. It's what I found again and again is that the job isn't just what you think it is. There are so many other bits, and you would know this. But I think it's an amazing place to work. And everybody I spoke to felt like they were doing something that was worthwhile. And sometimes in journalism, most of the time in journalism, I don't feel like I'm doing something worthwhile. If I'm interviewing another Hollywood star about another Hollywood movie, you go, I'm just advertising something. I'm not adding something to the world. I'm not doing something that is meaningful to me or anyone else. And there are so many jobs that are just underappreciated, unseen, and death is one of them. I thought it was really stark during COVID, the early days of the pandemic, when people would go and stand on their doorsteps and bang pots and pans. I wondered how many of those people were banging pots and pans for the funeral directors and the people who were manning all of the temporary mortuaries that were popping up all over the cities. I don't think anyone was clapping for them because nobody wants to think about what happens after the person dies in the hospital. But those jobs have to be done. And I think if there's anyone out there who feels that they are able to, and I would say even if you have the slightest inkling that you might be able to, you probably can. There's so much fear that comes tied up in death, and I don't think the reality warrants it. I didn't find it as frightening as anyone believed it to be. Did you find that when you started working with death?
I wasn't prepared for questions, Hayley. Yes. There's certainly, and I describe it as a learning curve, a pecking order, if you will, and I mentioned, earlier, it's not for everyone. It's certainly a calling, and more than it is a profession, it is a lifestyle. And
Yeah.
I think you covered that greatly. And you said, you know, underappreciated. We appreciate you for this book, because you certainly have given the public an eye into the spectrum of death care and funeral professions.
Oh, thank
And
you.
one more question before we go to the Q&A. Something that I thought of as I read through this book and ended it. What will be your next topic? What's your next?
I would love to know. I don't know.
No,
I've gone back to magazines at the moment. The last person I interviewed was a professional soccer player. So that's about as far from death work as you can go.
Yeah, that's well, thank you, Hayley. I'll invite Omar back in so he could get some of those Q&As for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a couple questions, and please continue to ask your questions. From Christina, were or are the top reasons that people go into the death field?
Everybody had different ones, and obviously I didn't do a census of everybody who works in the field, but I found that, for example, Poppy, the funeral director I spoke to in the beginning, she went into it because she wanted to be involved in the huge life events of people, either birth, marriage, or death. And she really didn't care which one she went with, but she was in a job at the time. She was working in an auctioneer's house, an art house, Christie's and Sotheby's here in the UK. And she just felt like it wasn't at all meaningful and wasn't feeding her. And so it was birth, marriage, or death. And then both of her parents got cancer diagnoses in very quick succession. So she had to go and look at what was available for funerals. And she found them very stiff and old-fashioned, and nothing spoke to her or her parents, who were sort of arty weirdos. And then she herself nearly died. She got typhoid, and she said that the fact that she had to face death, her parents' death and her own, without ever having seen death, made it all the more frightening. And when she spoke to me, she likened it to being 9 months pregnant but never having seen a baby before. And so for her getting into the job, it was trying to make a change. She could help that fear in other people by explaining things about death. And she even wants to, she's the one who invited me into her mortuary to help dress a dead man for his coffin. And she would love to invite children into her mortuary to see what a dead body looks like before they have to. Which I think is interesting, and an interesting argument to have with people. But she just wanted to change things. She saw a problem in the world, and she saw that she could, in a very small way, try to fix it. And she does talk about things. She writes blogs, and through the social media feeds of her funeral home, she has death talking points, and she's very vocal about what we should be talking about. So most of the people I spoke to were quite progressive in their thinking. So that was the main one, wanting to change things.
Donna asks, did you find that most funeral directors and funeral homes were family businesses?
Yes. Yeah, so there were, but Kevin, the embalmer I spoke to, didn't go into the funeral industry because his parents were in the funeral industry. He tried to do something else, but he got pulled back in. So I think the force must be strong in family funeral homes, because it was something that turned up again and again.
This asked, mentioned that the most difficult part of the death profession was working with the living as they grieved. Was this a common theme across the professionals you spoke with? How did they say they coped with the emotions?
They did find that dealing with the living was the hardest thing. Even the guys who work in the crematorium, which is in the middle of a cemetery, said that they found it really hard. So they work in a cemetery every day, and something that got to them was the people they saw every day coming to visit the same graves with a bunch of flowers. And he described them as ghosts, and he really didn't know what to do. He said he doesn't believe in ghosts, but ghosts do exist in the cemetery where he works. And they're these, he said it was mostly the old widowers who didn't know what to do now that their wives were gone, but they came to the grave every day. And he said that, and it was true with everybody, that whenever they deal with the living, they want to do everything they can to make things better. But it was those men coming to the cemetery that they couldn't make anything better. So it was just this sort of bleak interaction with people. But if they had an interaction where they felt useful and could do something, that was the good part of their job. But if it was something where they just felt helpless, that was the thing that ate away at them.
A few questions that are a little bit, actually, we had a question just come in from Karen that says, as with other certain professions that deal with emotions of others, is there an increase in suicide rate amongst funeral directors?
I have heard anecdotally that there can be, but I'm not sure if there's any hard evidence on that. I do know that there are lots of new companies that have mental health help as part of the job, especially in the disaster response company. And that has come from mistakes being made and people being taken to disasters that they weren't emotionally prepared for. And yeah, I think mental health and thinking about it is something that has become much more common in recent times. And it is within the funeral industry too. But again, I found that the people it is offered to, the workers, found that they didn't really make use of it. They'd rather talk to each other because, like the bereavement midwives would rather talk to another bereavement midwife because she had been through what she had been through. It's like when soldiers come back from war and they just want to talk to other soldiers because nobody else understands what they have seen because their experience is so divorced from our own. So it is on offer, but yeah.
Lisa asks, did you find that the funeral directors you spoke with had a sense of humor and or were jokers? She says that the funeral directors that she knew did have a propensity for joke telling, perhaps as a way to cope.
All of them. I would much rather go to a bar with a bunch of funeral directors than I'm gonna Hollywood actors again, because if you go drinking with Hollywood actors, it's just, a crowd of neuroses and ego, and it's not fun. Whereas funeral directors, it's like they've seen the worst stuff that can happen. They've seen people at their most vulnerable, that they know what is possible for a human to go through. And they're not okay with it, but they've made some kind of peace with it. Maybe that's why. But also, I think when things get really dark, humans just crack jokes. It's what we do. It makes things better. I love detective shows, but I think the best detective shows, the darkest ones, always have moments of light because that's what we do when things are horrible. So that makes them more truthful to me. But funeral directors, I love them. They're great. I would much rather go to the bar with them.
There are a couple of pragmatic questions here. Mark asks, do you address the popular trend of burial in a pod that disintegrates and the decaying corpse feeds a tree sapling? I think he means a green or natural burial there.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, what was the question? Would I like that?
No, do you address it in the book? Is that
Oh,
something that you?
no, I don't. Not in this one. I was more looking at traditional jobs, but Caitlin Doughty does talk about this in her book From Here to Eternity. And I talk no, it was a Wired article I did about alkaline hydrolysis, which would be my preferred method of disappearing, which is water cremation. I mention it briefly in the book, but it doesn't really go into all the different ways of bodies disappearing.
Stephen asks a US specific question, but I'll expand it. Are the laws, regulations the same for moving dead bodies and ashes across state lines? Can both be mailed via the Postal Service, FedEx? I guess we can expand that to international travel.
I don't know.
Well, yeah.
You guys have different rules for different states, so I'm going to assume everything is different.
What do you think, Jesse?
Sure. Yeah, there are some specific mortuary laws that we have to follow and abide by, permitting and things of that nature, regulatory type things that are particular to state and national things. So yes, we do need to have the appropriate paperwork to transport human remains. As far as shipping human remains, it's done every day. We do it regularly. People don't always die at home. Again, it's checking with the appropriate consulate or state that needs to be abided by. And then for cremated remains, a little bit more regulated. It has to be shipped via the United States Postal Service in special labeled boxes and things of that nature, with the appropriate permits, of course.
Someone asks, are you and the industry concerned about increasing use of cremation and monitoring costs and fees in the funeral industry?
Burial is more popular in America than it is here. I think we're at 75% cremated, whereas maybe in America you're half and half. My concern with cremation is, like anything burning, I am worried about the environment, but I'm also worried about embalming fluid being buried. So I don't think either of those options are great. Alkaline hydrolysis, which I mentioned, is much more environmentally friendly and is available in, the last time I checked, it was something like 16 or 17 states in America. It's not available in the UK yet, despite the fact that the machines are made here. They're made in the north of England. Well, at least one of the main companies is, and the machine that they use to they water cremate the cadavers at the Mayo Clinic in one of these machines. That's made in the north of England and shipped out, but they haven't installed one in the UK here because people freak out. They think that a body being dissolved and going into the sewer, they've got this idea that it's sort of like mincemeat, and it's not. It's a really interesting way. It's sort of a superheat. It's a silver sort of tunnel, and it's superheated water and lye, which dissolves anything biological and turns it into this sterile liquid, which goes down the drain. And what you're left with is this perfectly white bones, which are then they go into the cremulator like normal cremains, and you get a bag of them at the end. You've got ashes, although they haven't been near a fire. I think that is the way forward. So yeah, I have concerns about cremation, but I don't think it's worse than burial.
We'll address one last question that's perhaps more of a philosophical question. Marsha asks, could you comment on the language of death, e.g. not using a stark term like died, as opposed to euphemisms such as passed away? and how this may reflect our level of discomfort with death and dead people.
I hate the euphemistic speech within the funeral industry. I hate it. And it's not just because I find it icky and fluffy and patronizing. It's not just that. It is all of those things. But to me, I think euphemisms just give you a blank space to fill. And to me, when I was 13 and my friend drowned, because nobody was telling me exactly what was happening to her and what her body looked like, I filled that blank space with horrors, because that's what you do when no one is giving you information. And information doesn't need to be given to you with any emotional slant on it. You can just say, this is happening. And it's neither good nor bad. It's just the truth. And I think euphemisms do the same for us as adults. They just give you a blank space and you have to fill it. And I find that I don't think they're helpful. I think it says to you, something is so horrible that we are hiding it from you. And once something is hidden, you want to know, well, why are you hiding it? Why do you think that I can't handle it? And I think that humans in general can handle far more than those funeral home websites with the little cursor that turns into a dove as you move your mouse across the screen. I think that we can handle a lot more than that type of talk thinks we can. We're quite strong, and I find it helpful and reassuring to be told exactly what's happening. And I don't find it scary. Even if it's not nice, it's far less scary than letting your mind run wild.
I agree with you on that, and just tell people what you need to tell them, and they will square that in their own minds and hearts.
Exactly. And that's what my book is, I hope.
Yes, and please, I put in links to buying the book, donating to the Mark Twain House, and also finding programs on our YouTube channel. I will be uploading this recording. You can find other really cool upcoming events on our website as well. So thank you so much to Hayley and Jesse for this really interesting conversation. Thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Hayley.
Thank you. Bye.